Hi, I'm Allie Hamilton, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the Come As You Are podcast. Every week, we'll be talking about some aspect of healing, usually around childhood wounds and complicated familial relationships. The topics will always coincide with my personal essay of the week, and this will be a place where we can take a deep dive together. I'm so thrilled you've joined me and delighted for you to always come as you are. Hi there. Hi there. Welcome to our talk today. The topic is orbital motion. And I was writing in the essay this week about a lot of different things. I'm a little under the weather, which you can probably hear in my voice. I'm going to try not to sniffle into the mic. And it made me think about a lot of my experiences growing up, but it's also about, I dropped my son off at college about a week and a half ago, and I went into New York and we interred my mother's ashes. So it's been a lot of loss and grief and change in the last week and a half. And so I wasn't really very surprised to wake up feeling sick the other morning. I've been on a couple of planes in the last week and a half, a couple of airports, a whole bunch of subway cars. I was in New York City, so there's all of that, but there's also the emotional component of dropping your firstborn off at college, not having gone through that before, not really having a sense of what life is going to feel like after that. And the ongoing, I feel, in the last few years, and this is something I've been talking about pretty regularly, is just the loss that is kind of intrinsic to this time of life. I'm in that sandwich generation moment where I have teenage children, and 2 out of 3 of my parents have passed in the last few years. My mom and dad. My stepdad is still kicking, but I'm in that space of being responsible for people and being pulled in lots of different directions. As your children grow, obviously their needs change, the way they need you changes. And so all of that, I think that part of what doesn't get talked about enough as far as entering this chapter in your life, which I prefer, I just like the middle years. The way that sounds to my ear is so much more poetic than middle age, which I was writing about. Makes me think of instantly, a guy on the couch, some sad dude with a belly on the couch, just I don't know, bad back or whatever, or the women that they put on the cover of the AARP magazines who are they're 70, which hey, they're gorgeous and beautiful, but they're not 55. So it's just very interesting the way that society sort of visually gives us messages about what middle age means, whereas my experience has not been that at all. It's been it is a period of time where there is loss. There's no doubt about that. And certainly losing both of my parents in a pretty short amount of time, and my mother in a very traumatic way, through ALS, which is just devastating motor neuron degenerative disease. It was brutal. And the grief that I felt over my mother for the year after she died, and ongoing, but really that first year just was, I've never experienced anything like it. And in the comments this week, there were a lot of people chiming in who were saying you can't, there are certain things in life that you can't know until you know. And one of the people who commented said that he's lost his mom, and actually we're on a similar trajectory. He lost his mother around the same time I lost mine at the end of 2021. And he just ran into a friend of his who just lost her mother and was saying to him, I don't think I realized at the time like how awful this was. Like I don't think I expressed my condolences in a meaningful enough way now that I know what this is. And we exchanged some comments back and forth because I also experienced that. You know, when my mother passed, I received some unbelievable condolence cards from people that were just people I didn't even know that well, or people that didn't even know my mother that well, who reached out. And you really can feel when someone is reaching out because they understand, they've been there and they've been through this tremendous loss, versus people who might not have gone through this yet, or not every situation is the same. Like anything in life, it's not, we can't paint any experience or, any group of people with one brush. But so there are people who have had to, who are estranged from one parent or the other or both for self-preservation. And so when the parent passes, they don't experience this exact, it's different. And the difference between my grieving process for my mom and my dad is wildly different. So I'm not, not saying that everyone has the same sort of untethered feeling that I had when I lost my mom, but I did feel that I felt unmoored. And then I think also when my mom died at the end of 2021 and my dad died in July of 23. And so that's also a strange sort of like, it's a weird feeling, as a grown woman and with children of your own, to feel orphaned in this way. But there is something really strange about being on a planet where neither of your parents are anymore. There's something profound about that experience. Anyway, he was saying that this woman had expressed to him, that she felt like she didn't convey a deep enough expression of just condolence when he lost his mom. And there are, I really related to that sentiment because you can feel it. And that's okay. Also, there were people who I think expected me to, quote unquote, feel better after a few months because they haven't been through it. Or even, it's like that year mark, people are kind of like expecting you to turn the corner. And I think you do in a way, in the sense that the grief is not, doing you in, and, you learn to, you can get used to anything, I think. And you can learn to live with anything after enough time has gone by. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean it isn't like a constant ache, but it's not that same level of grief that's just like doing you in. And so I did start to experience around the year mark like a way to integrate the grief into my daily life, and and to understand this is just with me, and it can soften you if you allow it to do that. And I think that the way that I lost her also was just so painful, and I had a lot of trauma around that after. She did not go peacefully, even though I was with her and, stroking her hair and holding her hand. It's just the nature of that disease is so horrific, and it ravages people. It's very painful, to lose someone that way, and to see someone just like wasting away in a bed that was a force of nature her entire life, and it's just like stripped down to bones. It's just devastating. And we had our own difficulties, my mom and I, which I've written about a lot and talked about a lot. It was not an easy relationship. I loved her so intensely, but she was not someone who, she didn't make it easy. She, first of all, was an alcoholic and like would not acknowledge that or get help or, take any kind of responsibility for her behavior because of that, things that she would do or say when she was drinking, that she wouldn't apologize or. And so it was difficult. A lot of my relationship with her had to do with boundaries, physical boundaries. Like I moved 3,000 miles away so that I could partly figure out who am I, not in the context of my mother and her alcoholism. Like, who am I? I was so entangled in that identity of being her daughter that it was really hard for me to figure out, like, how do I disentangle myself from that identity and figure out like who I am in a different context just as me. And so part of that involved like having to physically and geographically create space. And then some of it was other things, like the time of day I would speak to her. Obviously, we're 3 hours earlier in Los Angeles than we are in New York. And so I was always doing the math in my head, like when I would call her or when I would answer her call. If it was after 5 or 6 o'clock New York time, I generally would not pick up the phone if she called because I knew there was a good chance she would have started drinking or that maybe she'd already been drinking. And I would never call her at that time. I would always try to call her like mid-morning Los Angeles time was good because that was like afternoon New York time, and usually for my mom the Chardonnay would come out around 5. And so doing that math in your head is not, ideal. Obviously, when you're in a close relationship with someone, having to create space and boundaries is not comfortable or ideal, but depends on the situation. For me, I did love her and I did want her in my life, but there were times it was incredibly painful regularly. She just would say things and do things when she was under the influence that were really painful. She would go for my jugular. She would say things that were inappropriate or unkind. It was difficult. And so I was constantly, maneuvering and managing and trying to keep my own heart safe and not wanting to write her off. She was also a wonderful grandmother. She had a lot of amazing qualities. Her drinking was not the only thing about her, so that whole, you can't ever paint anyone with one brush. She's incredibly loyal to her friends. And there was always, if, any of her friends fell on hard times, there's always a room at our house. She was very smart, very funny, could be really kind, but could also be really unkind, and had a very, very terrible temper. And so it was a mixed bag loving her. She's really impressive in so many ways and really scary in ways. And it was not easy. But at the end of her life, when she could no longer speak, I really feel like that is when she and I started communicating in the most open and honest way that we had probably ever, because I didn't care about any of that anymore. And I think that's part of what I was trying to write about this week is you get to this point in life and you start to realize how fragile it is and how fast it is, and how difficult it is also to be a human being. Orbital motion is like the forward motion of the earth, and then there's like gravity and the way the sun is pulling on the earth, and that's what's keeping the earth spinning and orbiting around the sun. And just like this realization that we are on this spinning planet in one solar system in a vast universe that we're never gonna, that's expanding and expanding and expanding. And you get like a blink of time. And none of that is easy. Those are not easy parameters. Once you realize, I don't know how much time I have, I don't know how much time anyone else has, that's an intense amount of vulnerability to have to face and integrate and accept. And we, as human beings, we really like to pin things down and plan things and know what's coming next. And so we have our routines and we have our, like our things that we do. I use this example a lot, but it's I've been teaching yoga for a long time. It's like people like to put their mat in the same space. People like some familiarity, some routine, something they can count on. And you don't want to start the day and kind of feel like there's nothing I can count on except that anything and everything could change today. Like, nobody wants to really be thinking about that all the time in the forefront. And I don't think it has to be in the forefront of your mind. But I think what happens is that it just naturally moves to the forefront of your mind as you enter this era because things are changing so drastically. So, losing my mom, losing my dad, just really, it was painful. And my dad was different. I was mentioning that earlier because I had just if my relationship with my mother was complicated, my relationship with my dad was just like, he was just not, he just wasn't a good dad. Those are the simple words, for many, many reasons, most of which had to do with his own sort of self-obsession. And he was a very self-obsessed kind of person and self-absorbed and self-oriented. Everything in his life was kind of like about him and how he felt and what he needed and all that. And so that was from the time I was tiny. But it was a real kind of, mind, it's just not easy because when I was little, I really thought he hung the moon, like I think most kids think, and he was always the victim. So, and fidelity was not he cheated on everyone, his first wife with my mother, and then my mother with multiple people. And actually, I know from my half sister, my mother was not his first affair. And he just went on that way. He just really hurt every woman in his life, all three of his kids. So it's just painful. But for whatever reason, at the time that I came into the picture, he really leaned on. He would talk to me. He would confide in me from the time I was like tiny, 4, 5, 6, all the way till I was like 13. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Now that I have enough autonomy and experience out in the world to kind of see, like, you're the problem. You're not the victim. You're the perpetrator. It's not these women who won't share you. It's you who cannot, keep your, yeah. So, and he just had no sense of boundaries, or he really made it impossible for me to have any kind of like normal childhood because he was talking to me like I was his therapist or his wife. And then as I got older, when I was like a teenager, and I said at 13, I was like, I don't want to come over anymore. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I don't want to listen to your problems. You are the problem. You're the one creating all this pain for everyone around you. And, maybe stop getting married. If you can't be faithful, why do you keep marrying people and hurting them and hurting all the women that you sleep with? Like, maybe you just should not do that. But anyway, I did keep spending time with him. But after I created the boundary and said, I don't want to hear about this anymore, he really didn't know how to talk to me about anything. There wasn't anything he really wanted to talk to me about because he wasn't that interested in me and my life. He said that he was. He said he was really proud of me. I think he was, in the sense that maybe like he thought I made him look good, but he wasn't really, invested in me or how I was or if I was okay. And if he had been, he never would have been like laying all that stuff on me as a child. So as I got older, it's just things were, when I was like a teenager, 15, 16, 17, 18, and all the way, like through the rest, he would like it if people on the street thought we were a couple. That's like not normal. And I know that because he would say it. He'd put his arm around me. I'd be like 15 or 16. We're walking down Columbus Avenue and be like, look at all these men, like looking at you and wondering like how this old coot got this hot young. It's like, Dad, that's disgusting. That's disgusting. For you to want people to think that is not normal. But I didn't have the language to say that. I just had the emotion. I had the rage, but not the ability to express it. And that's a big part of what I was writing about this week, is that throughout my childhood, I had a lot of physical symptoms. I had asthma when I was little. It was very interesting because, like, we had a cat when I entered the picture. My mom and dad were living in the apartment where my mom stayed, and my stepdad still resides on the Upper West Side in New York City. And my mom, we had a cat named Bosco, and I loved this cat. Apparently, I was 2 when Bosco died, so like a little over 2, I think, maybe 2.5. But so my memories of Bosco are cloudy, but I apparently, like, cat allergies don't show up until around 2. And I was just reading, so I was so interested when I started thinking about this, that cat allergies often don't show up until around 2. It can happen earlier, but usually that's when kids will become symptomatic. And apparently your potential for being allergic to cats goes up if you're exposed in the first 2 years of your life, which sounds counterintuitive to me, because it feels like if you're exposed to sort of cat dander and all that, like early, and the saliva, it's something in the saliva with cats, and they were licking their fur, and then the fur is going everywhere. I would think like being exposed to it would give you sort of like the, it's not antibodies exactly, but like, I would think that it would have the reverse effect, that you'd be less likely to be allergic, but apparently that's not the case, or at least that's not what they think as of now. So anyway, we had a cat, but eventually I became incredibly allergic to cats and horses and dust mites. And it was bad. I would have all the things you would expect, like my eyes would get itchy and teary, and my nose, and I would break out in hives. But then eventually got asthma, and asthma for a kid is really scary. I think it's scary for anyone, that feeling of not being able to breathe. Like you are using all of your strength to try to suck oxygen into your lungs, and the available space feels like so tiny, and there's this like wheezing, feeling and sound that accompanies that effort. And no matter how hard you try, you're just not getting in enough air, and it feels like every breath you take, you're getting in less and less. So it's really scary, But when I was growing up, I wouldn't be scared if it happened around cats or horses. In fact, I was taking horseback riding lessons for quite a while at Claremont Stables. And I was writing about how crazy that was, because I would leave that lesson, and my eyes would be swollen shut. I'd have hives all over my body. I'd be wheezing, but I wasn't scared when it was happening around horses and cats, because I knew why. I know that I'm going into this lesson, and I know I'm going to need to take medication as soon as I come out. Sometimes I would take it before. I would have to shower as soon as I got home, and just like get get all of that like stuff off of me. But when it would happen, because I was emotional, and that's the part that like my parents would not acknowledge really. If I started crying hard, it could kick into an asthma episode. Or if I was angry, any emotion that created a change in breathing, right? Because that's what's happening when you're having a nervous system response, fear or rage or, deep grief. Anything that's impacting your nervous system in a profound way is going to affect your breathing. All of us, if you are in a state of fight or flight, first thing that goes is the deep breath. You have that like chest breathing. And what would happen for me as a kid is that I would feel that feeling, and I'd get scared because I would know that I'm not going to be able to breathe soon. And that fear of not being able to breathe soon, of course, creates more anxiety and more of a nervous system response. It's this like vicious cycle, and then you're wheezing, and then you can't get enough, breath. And so, and my parents would say that it was happening for no reason, like it's not cats, it's not horses, you're just having this, experience. And that was scary, because the message is like, this could happen anytime, anywhere, for no reason. There's no way to prevent it. There's no way to predict it. There's no way to control it. It can just happen. And that is when it was really scary for me. And I had other things. I was grinding my teeth very loudly at night, so much that I would sometimes wake up my mom in the next room, and she would tell me in the morning. Or at my dad's first apartment after the divorce, they got divorced when I was 4, it was like a big open space, and there were 2 loft beds in that space, and he would sometimes climb up my ladder and shake my foot to get me to stop. And I remember the dentist telling my mom that I had like very deep grooves in my teeth, like U-shaped teeth from all this grinding. So I was saying that, like, in today's world, if you have a little kid who is having asthma attacks when they get upset, or is grinding their teeth so loudly at night they're waking you up in the next room, you would figure it out, right? You'd be like, okay, something's going on. It could be anxiety. It could be a lot of, could be a lot of things here, but you would be trying to. And I think in the 70s, it was just different. And definitely my parents were wrapped up in their own stuff. There's no doubt. But I also think that Gen X is like, there are a lot of similar personality traits and coping mechanisms, because it was this time of like, the 10 p.m. public service announcement, like, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? Like, it was just a different time. It was a different world. And children were, I think, kind of, again, I'm not painting everyone in the same brush, but I think there was this expectation of like, you're to be seen and not heard, and you're supposed to like do well in school and listen when you're spoken to, and, be quiet when you're not, and all of that. And it's funny, just as I was talking, I just for some reason saw this thing Jennifer Aniston was saying about how when she was a kid, she was like maybe like 8 or 9 or something, she was sitting at dinner with her family, and she was excused after dinner because one of her parents said, it's time for you to go in the other room. You don't have anything interesting to add to the conversation because you're a kid. It's like terrible messaging, but we just all, it's like, and then I grew up in New York City, and I was a latchkey kid. I was going back and forth, 3 nights at my dad's, 4 nights at my mom's, and then 4 nights at my mom's, 3 nights at my dad's. It alternated every week. I could never remember like where I was going, or, especially when I was little. As I got older, it made me a very, I became really like schedule obsessed, like I always, when I got to be a certain age, like I wanted to know where I was going and what I needed and make sure I had all my stuff with me. It made me very intense in that way of like, do I have every single thing from my mom's that I'm going to need for like 3 or 4 nights at my dad's, let me not forget anything, because they wouldn't like meet up. And you can't always I mean, in their case, it wasn't that far. We weren't very far apart. We were like, I don't know, 10 blocks away. But I knew that wasn't going to be easy. And they had an acrimonious situation. It just was like, the more I could avoid that, the better. And there are a lot of other things, that happened along the way. Neither one of them, I think that like my mom was 28 when my parents split, and her mom had just died. She, for the last year of my parents' marriage, she knew it wasn't going to last, because she knew about all the infidelities. Like they just continued and continued. And I think she was so heartbroken and enraged and deeply disappointed and embarrassed, like all these things. But she wanted to keep up appearance. She didn't want her mother to be worrying about her. because my grandmother had breast cancer, and the last year of her life was really difficult. My mom did not want her mom to be worrying about what was going to happen to us, or knowing that the marriage was not going to last. So they were keeping up appearances, and literally like the week after my grandmother died, my dad left. So my mom was going through her own, post-traumatic experience, and I think also had lost her dad at 13. Like, my mom had a lot of trauma in her life that she never got any help with. She was not somebody who would go to therapy. She was not somebody who was going to learn how to like calm her nervous system or manage her anger, or her understandable anger. Like, she wasn't someone who was going to go and get help or admit that she needed help. And that made her life and mine a lot harder than I think it needed to be. And it makes me really sad. If there's one thing that I have so much sadness over, it's like I just wish she had gotten some help along the way, because I think she could have been so much happier, and she wouldn't have wanted to numb out every night. I think that was, a huge part of what was creating the alcoholism, was this deep need to not feel this way, to get some relief from her pain and her rage. And there are obviously like better ways to process your emotions than that. And that's, again, like what I was writing about, is that when you repress this stuff, which I did, I learned from both my mother and my father, my rage was not welcome, and neither was my sadness or my fear or my grief. I have written about this, and I'm writing about it in my memoir, but I'll share it with you anyway. Like, when I remember when I was six, my parents had been split for 2 years, and my dad came to get me from my mom's, and I heard them arguing in the kitchen over money and women, and it wasn't pretty. And I was standing in the hallway, and I was listening to this, and then my dad yelled for me to come, and I was 4 feet away. Anyway, came into the kitchen, we left, but my mom, like, she didn't even look up, like her face was like twisted and just like anger and upset over their interaction. And so when I came into the kitchen, I had my little bag, whatever, like, she didn't hug me goodbye. Like, I left with my dad, and I hated that. When I would leave my mom's, I could still getting emotional about it. It was a terrible feeling to leave her and not have any kind of like, anything on my way out the door. And so I left with my dad, and he instantly, as soon as we hit the street, was like talking about like this woman or that. I mean, it was just, it was never ending. And we would walk from my mom's to my dad's, the 10 blocks, and like we would stop at this little candy store, and he would always get a small bag of roasted salted cashews, and I would get a small bag of red Swedish fish. And so we went in. I was in a really bit, in fact, I think it happened before we went in. We got to the store. I didn't want to go. He had asked me if I wanted to. I didn't want to. I was not okay. And I think we stopped outside the store, and I just started bawling. And he was shocked, because he had been talking to me, whatever. And so he got like down, and I said, I wish I had never been born. And I was 6. And I think about my own kids at 6, and like, that is a devastating thing for a 6-year-old to be feeling. It's just like, oh, I mean, what is happening? And my dad got down in front of me, and he turned purple, and he was angry. He was like, don't you ever say that. Don't ever say that, and I was like, oh, I started apologizing to him, and he hugged me, and, so like I ended up taking care of him in that moment. He's like, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Don't you ever say that, and I'm sure he had a lot of like horror over what I had said, but it didn't come out in a way that, it wasn't like, why do you feel that way? Or what is going on? Or what's happening? It was, don't you ever say that again. And I received it as like, I'm in trouble. And then we went into the store, and I was trying to act, normal, whatever that means. And we got the Swedish fish and the cashews and left the store. And I remember trying to swallow those effing fish over this giant lump in my throat and how painful it was. So there's a lot of my childhood that I spent repressing, emotion, just like normal, understandable emotion, and it would come out in these other ways. And one of the ways, aside from like the asthma, which there are a lot of things, right? It's like, it's not one thing. I mean, my grandfather had it, so there's very likely, a predisposition, definitely allergens, but also emotion. And that's the part that got like washed out of it. Like that just wasn't going to be addressed. And the teeth grinding, I mean, maybe there were other causes aside from stress. I don't know, but none of that was sort of like dealt with or looked at. And my anger or my sadness, anytime I expressed that around either parent, it was like, that's not okay, because now you are, I'm going to turn this down. Now you are like in a situation where you're editing out your feelings to make other people comfortable. You're kind of, you're being forced to take care of people when you yourself are in need. You're in a lot of need. And so that's a lot for a kid to manage. It's a lot for a grown-up to manage, being in a situation where you're having a nervous system response that absolutely makes sense given the situation, and you are then tasked with managing other people's feelings about your feelings. It's like kind of, it's very gaslighting also, but I don't think it was intentional. I don't think there was like a manipulative, component to it in this case with my parents. I think they just were incapable of taking that in or taking that on at the time. And I think for my mom, she did not have the tools to be managing my anxiety and her rage and the stress of like being a single mom in New York City with a 4-year-old and like dealing with the grief of her mother dying. I think it was just too much. And so I learned I have to be good, and I have to be easy, and I have to try to be helpful, and I have to listen to my dad and try to like help him feel better and see if I can prevent my mom from like getting angry or wanting to drink. And it's too much, it's too much for, certainly for any kid, but really for any one of us. Just trying to push down your feelings like that leads to other problems. When I hit puberty, I started getting these wild migraines, like, lose my peripheral vision, end up crawling, nauseated, violent, serious migraines where sometimes I'd end up at the hospital because the pain just was so intense that, what you want when you're in that kind of, it feels like a broken bone in your head, it's just like screaming pain. And at a certain point, you just want to be put out of your misery. So that started happening when I hit my teenage years, and also disordered eating and body dysmorphia. And I, just like developed this perfectionism and very, very like type A, lots of list making and, making sure I had what I needed and knew what was going to happen and trying to predict things and avoid problems. I was just on high alert. I was on high alert all the time, and it took a real toll on my physical well-being and my emotional well-being. But I would get like strep throat every year. I would get bronchitis. I've had pneumonia 3 times in my life. I had H1N1. I've had COVID twice. So, I've had a lot of lung-related things, and that's part of what I was writing about, is that at a certain point, and today, that's not the case. COVID notwithstanding, I did get COVID twice, but I'm pretty healthy. Like, I really rarely get sick. And if I do, it's usually because I'm like run down in some way. Like this past week, there's a lot of emotion, or dropping my son off at college, or going to bury my mother's ashes. Like these things are super emotional. Plus, I'm like on planes and trains and, all that stuff. So I wasn't surprised, but it's pretty rare for me to get sick. I have tools now, right? Like when I was 20, I started doing yoga, and I find it interesting and funny that I mean, I'm not funny really, but like that I was drawn toward that because it's a practice about breathing deeply and consciously. And it's funny that I started my life struggling with that, and that the last, 30 years of my life have been so much about breathing deeply and quieting my mind and really giving my mind something to focus on that's happening in the now. Because coming out of that childhood and young adulthood and adulthood, it took a while. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't overnight. But I would say the last kind of like 30 years of my life have been very much about healing and about finding tools to calm my nervous system and slow down my breathing and quiet my mind and just find some ease inside myself, and also to get comfortable with uncertainty. And that's the name of a book too. There's like Pima Chadron has written a few books that are so great. When Things Fall Apart, Comfortable with Uncertainty. These are like some of my favorite books. She's brilliant. But I do think that's part of this phase of life, and I feel very grateful that so much of the philosophical practice of yoga is about that, is about understanding that everything is in a constant state of flux. That's like the one thing you can count on. And to try not to grip. And I was someone who really did a lot of gripping and trying to control and manage and plan and nail down. And, I liked routines and all of that. And I learned along the way, like, life just feels so much better when you hold things lightly and loosely. And when you can be in more acceptance that everything is in a state of flux, it makes the experience, the ride, the orbital motion, there's just so much more joy in the mix. And as much as I was sobbing as I drove home after leaving my son at college. As soon as I got home and we texted, and I knew that he was doing well, like he had already gone to Trader Joe's with his roommates, and he was going to like an event with his girlfriend. Like, I was fine then. I'm like, okay, he's okay. And if he's okay, then I'm okay, and I'll get used to not having him in the house, even though he's been in the house for almost 18 years. He's gonna turn 18 in November. Like, it's a big transition, and it's another one of those times where it's really interesting because the people who've been through it understand instantly. The people who have teenage kids who are about to go through it understand. And then there are people that don't have kids at all who really seem to understand, because there are just people in this world who are naturally, I think, or maybe it isn't natural, maybe they've just been through their own suffering and their own losses, and so they recognize what that is in any form. There are people that are just so beautifully able to express their love, their support, their solidarity, their understanding. And then there are people who don't really get it. And that's okay, because I think there are some things that you only learn by going through them, and there are some people who only learn by going through things themselves. And, it's not one brush. It's like there can be people who understand some things without going through them, but not others. It's like, whatever. It is what it is. I have zero issue if somebody, and if I say, like, oh, I just dropped my son off at college, and someone's response is like, oh, wow, big chapter. Like, Okay, you have no idea. You don't understand, but that's okay because maybe you will at some point, maybe you won't, whatever. But the people who are like, oh, are you okay? Those people have been there or they just understand it so I think that's so many things in life, and to try to give people some grace, because that is ultimately what I was writing about, is that there is so much loss wrapped up in life. And you might not realize that until you get to these middle years, but you're going to realize it eventually. There's so much loss wrapped up in the experience of being human, and so much change, and so much flow, and so much absolute inability to know what's going to happen next, even though we like to know. That the more you can get comfortable with that, just like the softer you become, the more empathy you have to extend, the less you feel like you know everything. It just humbles you and it opens you, and I think it really makes some of the best people, if you can just kind of like open your hands and open your heart and open your mind, it really makes everything better, and it makes you realize how fragile it all is, and how fragile you are, and how your best option is to really love, like love loudly, love, demonstrably, like really show that and express that. And if there are things that you feel are not as they should be in the world around you, like fight, try to like make things better for people, like just do anything and everything you can to leave it all on the field, because you just don't know. And I think that like the older you get, the more you confront that, and you either confront it in a peaceful way, or you fight it. And I really recommend the former. It just feels better when you accept that as like part of life, right? So I hope that this was helpful. If you are grieving, or if you're moving through intense change in your life right now, if you are, if you're struggling, like somebody in one of the comments under, I think it was this week's essay, might have been moving violations, but someone was saying it's so hard, it's exhausting, like healing is exhausting, because you try to heal from things that have happened in the past, but then there are things that keep happening in the present. And I think that that's like the last thing I'll say is that, first of all, I totally recognize that feeling. But also, I think my definition of healing has changed over the years and over the decades. Like I think healing has happened when whatever ways you were let down, betrayed, abandoned, whatever happened in your early childhood experiences, when those feelings are no longer controlling your behavior, right? Your decisions, your actions, like whatever that stuff is, whether you have abandonment stuff that arises, or you have, avoidant tendencies because intimacy was not a good experience for you as a kid. You were, hurt or left or harmed, or whatever may have happened, abused, like that, when you're able to kind of unhook your journey from these things that happened in early childhood, because I do think that most of the stuff that we struggle with is stuff that happened in the first 4 to 5 years of life, for sure, and probably the first 10. We're so tender. 10, 12 years, like we're just little sponges. And so things that happen, things that people said or did, like that's such an impact on the way you feel about the world, or yourself, or your place in the world, or your role, like what it is you're supposed to be or do or feel. When you're able to just say like, okay, I can recognize these things that happened, and I can recognize the coping mechanisms that kind of resulted from that, and I know what my triggers are, and I have tools to manage those things when they arise. It's not like the wiring, it might be dormant, but it's still there, like it's still there in you. It can still get triggered. It can still get tapped. Somebody can hit a nerve. But as long as you're able to, like, oh, there's like that, there's my old friend, that like abandonment, fear of abandonment, like, as long as you can kind of see it and name it and extend some compassion to yourself and quell it, like allow that feeling to arise and then give it the attention and the understanding, and then it'll flow through you, as long as you're able to work that way. That to me is healing, right? But also, I think there's some component for me now too of just like integrating that, right? Like just being able to, there's certain things, I'm not someone who feels like, I think forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not the other person. There are certain things in life, like certain ways that people are abused or let down. They're just simply like, that's not a person you're going to want in your life anymore. But to me, like forgiveness is just, okay, that was all a reflection on that person. Things that happened to me when I was a kid, like that doesn't have to do with me. That's someone else, especially if we're talking about an adult, which is, we usually are. To be able to understand that, to me, is like that person is in a deep amount of like pain or dysfunction, or something's deeply wrong there. They don't feel empathy or whatever it is. I can recognize that. I can sort of like forgive that. It doesn't mean I want to tell the person, doesn't mean I have to contact them or ever see them again, but just to be able to move along with my life and not be weighed down by something that was not my fault and was no reflection on me. I think that's part of what happens too. And the softening is that you just realize certain people are bent in these ways by life. Things happen and it really impacts the way that they've grown, or what they are capable of, or what they can, what they're aware of. And I just find that the older I get, the more able I am to just kind of release those feelings, release the stories, even if I'm releasing them on a keyboard. They don't live in my heart in that same way. And so, yeah, I hope this was helpful to you. And I'm pretty easy to find if you want to talk or, express your thoughts. Like, I love reading your comments and appreciate when you share things, and I just love this community so much. So I want to thank you for spending some of your very precious time with me. I don't take it lightly, and I'm sending you lots of love. Until next time.